The alien princess trained under a human for 100 days. What she became shocked the galaxy, the Hall of Crystal Light, was silent, yet the silence felt heavy, almost judgmental. Princess Celira of the Virelian Empire stood alone at the center of the vast chamber. Tall pillars of glowing blue crystal rose toward the ceiling like frozen lightning, reflecting her image 100 times over. Every reflection showed the same thing: a slender alien woman with silver skin, long dark eyes, and shoulders drawn slightly inward, as if she wished to be smaller. Around her, the high court watched. Generals in layered armor, nobles wrapped in ceremonial robes, scholars with glowing data crests hovering near their temples. They all stared at her with the same unreadable expressions. Some looked disappointed, some looked bored, a few looked quietly cruel. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne grown directly from living crystal, was the queen, Celira's mother, Empress Valeth of Virelia, conqueror of 12 systems, breaker of 3 rival empires. Celira swallowed. The evaluation had ended moments ago. She already knew the result. She had known it before she even entered the hall. Still, part of her had hoped, foolishly, that this time might be different. A general stepped forward. His voice echoed, amplified by the chamber itself. Princess Celira's performance in the strategic and combat trials has been assessed. Celira kept her eyes forward. Her hands were clasped tightly behind her back. She could feel her heart beating too fast, as if trying to escape her chest. Reaction speed below standard. A murmur rippled through the court. Tactical adaptation insufficient. Another murmur, sharper this time. Command presence under pressure unstable. Celira flinched just slightly. She hated that word, unstable. The general paused, then finished. Conclusion: Princess Celira is currently unfit to lead Virelian forces in the upcoming galactic war simulation. The words settled like cold dust. Celira's gaze dropped despite her effort to hold it steady. She could feel heat rising behind her eyes, but she refused to let tears fall. Virelians did not cry in public, especially not royal ones. Across the hall, she sensed movement. Another figure stepped forward, Prince Kaler, her cousin. Tall, broad-shouldered, his armor polished to a mirror shine, he did not bother to hide his smile. "She tries," Kaler said smoothly, "but trying is not enough when the fate of empires is at stake." The court chuckled softly. Celira wanted to speak. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she had trained harder than anyone, that she had memorized every doctrine, every formation. But the words stuck in her throat. Every time she tried to force them out, her mind went blank. The queen raised one elegant hand, and silence returned. "Enough," Empress Valeth said. Her voice was calm, controlled, and far more dangerous than anger. "This is not a trial of mockery." Kaler bowed his head, though his smile lingered. The queen's gaze turned back to Celira. It was not unkind, but it was distant, as if the Empress were looking at a puzzle that refused to be solved. "You have failed this evaluation," the queen said. "Again." Celira lowered her head. "Yes, mother." The word tasted bitter. "For generations," the queen continued, "Virelian rulers have led from the front. Our people are strong because we are decisive. Fear has no place in command." Celira's fingers tightened. "I am not afraid," she said quietly. Several nobles exchanged looks. The queen studied her. "Then why do you hesitate?" Celira opened her mouth and closed it again. She did not know how to answer. "Because I see too many outcomes. Because I feel the weight of every life. Because I am terrified of being the reason someone dies." But she knew those answers would only prove the court's opinion of her. The queen leaned back slightly. "The Galactic Council has announced the war simulation will take place in one standard cycle. The winner will lead the United Fleets against the coming threat." Everyone in the hall understood the meaning. Losing was not an option. "You will not represent us in your current state," the queen said. Celira's chest tightened. "Then I will step aside." The words felt like surrender. A sharp sound echoed through the hall as someone struck the floor with a staff. All eyes turned to the speaker, an elderly counselor with pale markings along his face. "There may be another option," he said slowly. The queen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain." The counselor inclined his head. "If the princess cannot be trained by our methods, perhaps she must be trained by another's." A wave of confusion spread through the court. "Another empire?" a noble asked. "That would be an insult." "No," the counselor replied. "Not an empire." He paused, then said the word that changed everything. "A human." The silence that followed was deeper than before. Celira lifted her head, startled. Humans, she had studied them, of course, everyone had. A young species from a high-gravity death world, physically unimpressive, lacking natural armor, claws, or enhanced senses. They survived mostly through stubbornness and strange ingenuity. They were not respected. Humans are advisors at best, a general scoffed. Not trainers of royalty. They have survived conflicts that should have wiped them out, the counselor replied calmly, and they adapt faster than any species we have recorded. Prince Kaler laughed openly. You suggest we send the heir of Violia to be trained by a soft-skinned outsider? Celira felt her face grow warm, but she said nothing. The queen remained silent for a long moment. Her gaze drifted, unfocused, as if she were recalling distant memories. Battles, reports. Strange human victories that made no sense on paper. Finally, she spoke. Who is the human? The counselor's eyes glowed faintly as he accessed his data. Commander Elias Ward, retired, former Special Operations. Known for surviving engagements with casualty projections above 90%. A few generals shifted uncomfortably. He refuses titles, the counselor continued. Refuses ceremonial ranks. But those who trained under him show abnormal resilience and decision-making under extreme stress. The queen looked back at Celira. For 100 days, the empress said, you will train under this human. The words struck Celira like a physical blow. Gasps filled the hall. You will obey him as you would a superior officer, the queen added. No court privileges, no exceptions. Prince Kaler's smile widened. Or she will break within a week. Celira straightened slowly. Fear flickered through her, sharp and undeniable. But beneath it was something else. A quiet, desperate hope. She bowed deeply. I will go. The queen nodded once. Prepare immediately. The decision was final. 2 days later, Celira stood aboard a small transport vessel as it slipped into hyperspace. The sleek comforts of royal ships were absent. No attendants, no musicians, no soft lighting, just functional metal walls and the low hum of engines. She sat alone, hands folded in her lap, staring at her reflection in the dark viewport. Why a human? She wondered. Part of her expected humiliation. Failure so complete that even her mother would finally give up on her. The ship dropped out of hyperspace above a remote world. Brown and green, scarred by storms and rugged terrain. No grand cities were visible from orbit, only scattered lights. The outpost was small, a cluster of reinforced buildings surrounded by training fields and obstacle courses. It looked harsh, exposed. As Celira disembarked, cold air hit her skin. The gravity felt heavier than standard. Her muscles protested immediately. A single human stood waiting near the landing pad. He was older than she expected. His hair was dark with streaks of gray. His posture was relaxed, almost careless, hands tucked into the pockets of a simple uniform. No visible rank insignia, no ceremonial display. He did not bow. He did not kneel, he simply looked at her, eyes sharp and assessing. You're late, he said. Celira blinked. I arrived precisely at... I don't care, the human interrupted. His voice was calm, not raised but firm. I care if you can listen. No one had ever spoken to her like that. I am Commander Elias Ward, he continued. Out here I don't answer to queens or councils. If you're here, you're a trainee, not a princess. Celira felt something twist inside her. Anger, yes, but also relief. I understand, she said. Elias studied her for another moment, then turned and started walking toward the base. Good, first lesson starts now. She hurried to follow, struggling to match his pace in the heavy gravity. What is the first lesson? She asked. He didn't look back. How to stand on your own feet, he said, because no one is going to carry you here. As the outpost gates closed behind them, Celira realized something with a sudden clarity. This place would not protect her. This human would not soften the world for her. And if she failed here, there would be no excuses left. For the first time in her life, the path ahead was terrifying and completely honest. The first morning on the human outpost began before Celira realized she had fallen asleep. A sharp sound cut through the small room, loud and harsh, nothing like the gentle waking tones used in royal chambers. Celira jolted upright, heart racing, her senses scrambling to understand where she was. The sound continued. She looked around the room, bare metal walls. A narrow sleeping platform, one small light panel flickering on and off. No attendants, no comforting presence, just silence between the sharp pulses of noise. She rose quickly, her feet touching the cold floor. The gravity still felt wrong, heavier than her body wanted. Her muscles ached from the previous day's travel and the long walk through the outpost. The door slid open without warning. Commander Elias Ward stood there, arms crossed. "You have 30 seconds," he said. "30 seconds for what?" Celira asked, still disoriented. "To be outside," he replied, "fully dressed." Before she could respond, the door slid shut again. Celira stared at it, stunned. In the palace, training sessions were announced days in advance. Schedules were honored. Rest was considered essential for peak performance. Here, none of that mattered. She moved quickly, pulling on the simple training clothes she had been given. They were plain, flexible, and offered no ceremonial protection. No symbols of rank, no colors of her house. By the time she rushed outside, the cold air bit into her skin. The sky was still dark, the distant horizon just beginning to lighten. Elias checked a device on his wrist. "Late by 12 seconds, he said. "I was not informed of the schedule," Celira said, trying to keep her voice steady. "That's the point," Elias replied. "Problems don't send invitations." He turned and began walking toward an open field lined with obstacles, walls, ropes, uneven terrain, and strange metal frames. "What is today's lesson?" Celira asked as she followed. Elias glanced back at her. "Learning how little your comfort matters." He stopped at the edge of the field. "Run," he said. Celira hesitated. "Run where?" "Until I say stop." She stared at him. "For how long?" Elias met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Longer than you want." Celira took a breath and began to run. At first it was manageable. Her species was not weak despite what others believed. She had trained all her life. But the gravity pressed down on her legs, each step heavier than the last. Minutes passed, then more. Her breathing became uneven. The cold air burned her lungs. Her muscles began to tremble. She slowed slightly. "Don't," Elias said calmly. She forced herself to continue. By the time he finally told her to stop, her legs gave out. She fell to her knees in the dirt, gasping for breath, her vision swimming. Elias crouched nearby, not touching her. "Why did you slow down?" he asked. "I was conserving energy," she said between breaths. "Strategic pacing, you were afraid of failing," he interrupted. Celira looked up sharply. "I was afraid of collapse," she corrected. Elias shook his head. "Same thing, you decided the future pain was more real than the present task." She wanted to argue. Instead, she said nothing. He stood. "Get up." Her legs protested, but she pushed herself upright. "Again," he said. The day continued like that. Running, climbing, carrying heavy objects across uneven ground. Exercises that made no sense to her training manuals. No energy weapons, no simulation fields. Just raw effort and exhaustion. When she finally collapsed at the end of the day, Elias handed her a bottle of water. She took it gratefully. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why train this way?" He shrugged. "Because when things go wrong, comfort disappears first." That night, Celira slept deeply, her dreams filled with endless running. The days that followed blurred together. Each morning came too early. Each task pushed her further than the day before. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not insult her. He simply expected compliance. And he gave no praise. When she completed a task, he moved on. When she failed, he adjusted the difficulty and made her try again. The hardest part was not the physical strain. It was the silence. No court observers, no rivals, no expectations to perform for anyone else. Just her, the task, and the knowledge that quitting was entirely her choice. On the 10th day, she finally broke. They were running drills through a narrow canyon near the outpost. The ground was uneven, filled with loose stone. Celira slipped, falling hard and scraping her arm against rock. Pain flared sharply. She lay there staring at the sky, chest heaving. "I can't," she said aloud. "This is pointless." Elias stopped a short distance away. "It hurts," she continued, anger rising. "You train me like a human, but I am not one. My people fight differently. We rely on coordination, on superior technology." Elias walked back and stood over her. "When your technology fails," he said, "what do you have left?" She opened her mouth to answer and found nothing. He extended a hand. She hesitated, then took it. As he pulled her up, he said, "I'm not trying to turn you into a human. I'm trying to make sure you're still useful when everything else is gone." That night, Celira sat alone in the small dining hall, slowly eating a simple meal. Her arm was bandaged, her muscles sore beyond anything she had known. Other humans moved around the base, nodding to Elias, barely glancing at her. No one stared. No one whispered. For the first time, she was invisible, and strangely, she did not hate it. Weeks passed. Elias began adding new challenges. tactical games played on simple boards instead of holographic simulations, scenarios where information was incomplete or deliberately wrong. "You assume perfect data," he told her after one failed exercise. "Reality is messy." He forced her to make decisions with limited time, to choose who to protect when she could not save everyone. Each failure weighed heavily on her. Each success felt quiet, almost private. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, Celira finally asked the question that had been growing inside her. "Why did you agree to train me?" she asked as they walked back toward the base. Elias was silent for a long moment. "Because someone once gave me the same chance," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "I failed a lot," he added. "People thought I wasn't suited for command, too cautious, too emotional." She slowed slightly. "What changed?" "I learned that caring doesn't make you weak," Elias said. "It just means you have to work harder." The words settled deep inside her. By the 30th day, Celira noticed something unexpected. She was no longer afraid of exhaustion. She still felt pain. She still struggled. But the panic that used to rise when things went wrong had begun to fade. In its place was focus. One afternoon, Elias set up a simulated emergency inside the base. Power failure, limited oxygen, multiple injured personnel. Celira froze for half a second, then moved. She assigned tasks. She prioritized airflow. She ignored protocol when it slowed her down. When Elias deliberately contradicted her orders, she stood her ground. When the simulation ended, the room was quiet. Elias nodded once. "That," he said, "was leadership." Celira felt something warm rise in her chest. Pride, not the loud kind celebrated in the court, something steadier. That night she stood outside the base looking up at the unfamiliar stars. She thought of the palace, of the court's judgment. Of the version of herself who would have hesitated, who would have waited for approval. She was not that person anymore. She was still far from finished. But for the first time, she believed that the path forward did not require her to become someone else. It required her to become stronger where it mattered most. The following days blurred into one continuous, grueling test. Celira had learned to wake before dawn, to run her miles, to follow Elia's every order without question, and to accept the silence that accompanied her training. In the space of a few weeks, her body had transformed. Where once she had been soft and refined, now she was leaner, stronger, with muscles she never knew she had. But it wasn't just her body that changed. Her mind had begun to adapt to the harsh rhythm of human training. Every move, every failure, and every success now carried weight. She no longer hesitated before making decisions. Her thoughts moved faster, sharpened by the constant pressure of making the right choice in the heat of the moment. But she still wasn't where Elias needed her to be. It was on the 50th day that things began to shift. They were in the midst of a live-fire drill in one of the outpost's training zones, a barren, rocky stretch of land with scattered targets and rough terrain. The exercise was simple: disable the targets, work through obstacles, and return to base. "Ready?" Elias called to her. Celira nodded, checking the equipment she had been issued, a simple combat rifle and a combat knife, nothing like the advanced technology her people used. The weapon was heavier than she expected, and the sight felt clumsy in her hands. "You don't have time to think about it," Elias warned. "Just do it." She didn't need any further motivation. She gripped the rifle and sprinted across the uneven ground, dodging rocks, leaping over low walls, and aiming at the targets as they appeared. Each target had to be hit in a precise location. She couldn't waste time on weak shots. She couldn't waste time, period. The weight of the gun grew heavier with each step, but she didn't slow down. The discomfort, the sting in her arms, the strain in her legs, none of it mattered anymore. She focused on the job, moving like a machine. Every action was instinct, honed by the days of constant training. The first few shots hit the targets perfectly. Then, just as she reached a low stone wall, an explosion went off nearby, throwing dirt and rock into the air. She crouched instinctively, but the blast had sent a shockwave through her. For a moment, she lost her footing and nearly tripped. She didn't hesitate. She regained her balance, scanned her surroundings, and moved forward. A few steps later, another explosion rocked the field, but this time she was ready. She dropped to the ground, waiting for the shockwave to pass before pushing herself back up and continuing toward the next target. Elias watched from a distance, observing every move. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Celira was no longer the timid princess she once had been. She had become something new, something capable, something unafraid. But the moment she reached the final target, she hesitated. The rifle was heavy in her hands, her chest tight from the exertion. She had been running, dodging, firing for so long that the fatigue was starting to hit her. Her legs felt like lead. Her breath came in short bursts. "Don't wait for perfection," Elia's voice cracked through the intercom. "You don't have time, shoot." The command was simple, but it was enough to break the hesitation. Celira squeezed the trigger and the final target fell with a satisfying thud. She didn't even have to look at it. She just knew she had hit the mark. The exercise ended, but Celira stood there, breathing heavily. Her heart pounded in her chest and sweat dripped from her forehead. She was exhausted, but there was something else. A kind of quiet pride in knowing she had done something she never thought she could. Elias walked over, his footsteps steady and deliberate. He wasn't out of breath at all. "You didn't hesitate," he said, his voice low and measured. "You're getting better." Celira nodded, her chest still heaving as she wiped the sweat from her brow. "I'm not where I need to be, though." Elias glanced at her, a rare flicker of approval in his eyes. "No one is, but you're closer than you were yesterday." That night, as Celira sat alone in her quarters, she thought about what Elias had said. She was getting better, but better was a far cry from being ready for the war simulation that was fast approaching. The idea of facing her people in a galactic competition, of having her leadership tested in front of the entire galaxy, terrified her. But Elias had made it clear that fear was not a luxury she could afford. The next morning, Celira woke to the sound of a loud bell ringing through the compound. It was the signal for the beginning of another grueling day. She stood, quickly dressing in her standard training clothes, and went outside. Elias was waiting for her, standing at the edge of the obstacle course. "Today is different," he said as she approached. "Different how?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the previous day's exercise. "This time," Elias said, his voice grim, "we're going to simulate the kind of situation you'll face in the simulation." Celira's heart sank. "You mean a war scenario?" Elias nodded. "We'll have a mock battle. I'll play the role of your opponent, and you'll need to adapt quickly. You'll have to think on your feet, make decisions fast, and lead your team to victory. There's no room for hesitation." "I don't have a team," she said quietly, realizing the truth of his words. "I'm alone." Elias gave her a long look. "No one leads alone." The mock battle began moments later. Elias had set up a series of simulated obstacles, some in the form of false enemy positions, others representing difficult terrain. Celira moved through the course, dodging shots from simulated weapons and working through the maze of traps that Elias had set. At first, she stumbled. She was moving too quickly, her mind too focused on avoiding the enemy to make any real decisions. The exercise had become a blur of flashing lights, the whistling of simulated projectiles, and the constant, urgent need to survive. But slowly, as she began to get a feel for the course, she started to think. She had seen how Elias moved through the world, calm, measured, calculating. Her people had always relied on sheer strength and numbers in battle. But Elias taught her something more important, the art of controlling the battlefield with only the mind and the will to act. She ducked behind a rock as a barrage of simulated fire came her way. The sound was deafening, but her training kicked in. She took a deep breath and for the first time stopped thinking about the danger and focused on the situation. She could win this. She had to. The next few moments felt like hours. She crept through the field, using the terrain to her advantage. She placed fake charges where Elias would least expect them. She used the rocks and debris to set up ambushes, forcing him into traps. It wasn't the brute force she had been taught as a child, but a different kind of strength, one built on patience, adaptability, and cunning. As the battle wore on, Celira's movements became more fluid. She adapted, shifting strategies when one tactic didn't work. She began to think like a human, using the environment around her to her advantage, taking risks when necessary, and learning from every mistake she made. When the battle ended, Elias stood in front of her, his expression unreadable. "Well," she asked, breathless from the exertion. He nodded once, a small sign of approval. "You did well," he said, "but there's still more to learn and more to unlearn." Celira smiled, the first real smile she had shown in weeks. "I'll do better next time." Elias didn't answer, but the brief nod he gave her told her everything she needed to know. He was starting to believe in her. That night, Celira lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room. The past few weeks had been exhausting, but they had also opened her eyes to a different kind of strength. She had spent most of her life being told how she should act, what was expected of her as a princess, a future ruler. But none of that had prepared her for the reality of leading in battle, for the weight of the lives she would be responsible for. Her training had only just begun, but one thing was clear. She was no longer the fragile, uncertain princess who had stepped onto this world weeks ago. She had become something else, something stronger. And she knew, deep down, that she could face whatever came next. The next phase of Sailira's training was harder than she had ever imagined. The mock battles, the drills, the long hours of practice, they were nothing compared to what Elias had planned next. For the past month, she had been learning how to adapt, how to lead, how to make split-second decisions under pressure. But now, Elias was going to test the one thing she feared most, her ability to make decisions that could cost lives. She had been prepared for physical tests, for strategic games, even for simulated missions. But nothing had prepared her for the weight of responsibility that Elias would place on her shoulders. The first day of the new training was unlike any other. Elias woke her early, as usual, but instead of heading straight for the obstacle course, they walked out to a small section of the base that Sailira had never seen before. The sky above was clouded, the air thick with tension. There was a sense of something on the horizon. Sailira could feel it. "Today we'll simulate a rescue mission," Elias said, his voice low. "But this time it won't be just about getting in and getting out. There's a catch." Sailira didn't need to ask what the catch was. She knew that every training exercise with Elias came with some form of challenge. The real challenge, however, was always hidden beneath the surface. They reached the center of the zone, where a large structure stood. It resembled a collapsed building, surrounded by piles of debris. It was designed to simulate a disaster site, something like what a human city would look like after an attack. The debris scattered across the area was carefully arranged, making it seem as though parts of the building had crumbled. The simulation was incredibly detailed, realistic in a way that made Sailira's stomach churn. "This is a rescue operation," Elias said, pointing to the rubble. "There are civilians trapped inside. Your mission is to rescue them." Sailira's mind raced as she took in the scene. There were no time limits, no simulations for how to deal with what she was about to face. There were only people, real or simulated, whose lives would depend on her ability to make the right choices. "You will need to split your focus," Elias continued. "You need to identify which people to save first. There's limited time. Some of them may be unreachable. Some may not survive." The weight of his words hit her hard. Her instincts, honed over a lifetime of training, screamed at her to charge in, to fight, to take action without thinking. But Elias wasn't asking her to act impulsively. He was asking her to think like a leader. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. The pressure in her chest grew heavier, but she fought to steady her breathing. "Remember," Elias said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You cannot save everyone. You must make choices that could cost lives. The decisions you make here will test your ability to lead." The simulation began. Sailira sprinted forward, her eyes scanning the wreckage. Her senses heightened, and every muscle in her body screamed for action. She found the first group of survivors, 2 civilians, a man and a woman, pinned beneath a beam. The woman was unconscious, but the man was awake, struggling to free her. Without hesitation, Sailira approached the wreckage. She instructed the man to stay calm while she began working on lifting the beam. Her hands shook with the effort as she tried to move the heavy metal, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in, and the man's voice grew more frantic. His wife was still unconscious. "Stay calm," Sailira said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I will get her out. Stay calm." But her words felt hollow. She had been trained to think quickly, to take control of a situation, but this was different. The man's life was in her hands. The woman's life was in her hands. The pressure of it all weighed down on her. She glanced around, looking for help, but Elias wasn't there. There was no one else. The decision was hers. She reached into her belt for a plasma cutter and began working on the beam. Sweat trickled down her forehead as she struggled to cut through the metal, the noise of the cutter cutting through the tension of the moment. The seconds felt like hours. Every movement felt too slow, too deliberate. The woman's breathing was shallow, and Sailira's heart raced. Finally, the beam shifted. The man scrambled to pull his wife free, and together they managed to get her out. Sailira's hands were trembling, but they had saved one person, one life. But as soon as she turned her attention to the next section of the wreckage, her heart sank. There were more people trapped, dozens, maybe more. How could she choose? How could she decide who to save next? A scream echoed from the far side of the wreckage. It was a woman's voice, loud and panicked. Celira turned toward the sound, her chest tightening with dread. The woman was trapped under a pile of debris, pinned down with no way to escape. Her body was twisted, and blood stained the ground beneath her. Celira's heart pounded in her chest as she ran toward her mind already calculating the best way to free her. But as she reached the woman's side, a voice cut through the chaos. "Celira," Elias called from a distance, "you need to focus, you don't have time to save everyone." The words stung, but she didn't stop. She crouched next to the woman, checking her pulse. Her breathing was shallow, but she was still alive. Celira's hands shook as she tried to lift the debris. Her mind screamed at her to move faster, to work harder, but the weight of the woman's injuries was too much. She couldn't do it alone. She looked around, but no one was there to help her. The time was slipping away, and the woman's condition was worsening by the second. "You have to choose," Elias' voice echoed again. "You don't have enough time." Celira froze, her heart clenched. This was what he meant. This was the test. She could see the woman's pain, hear her desperate cries, but there were other people who needed help too. There were other lives at risk. Every second she spent trying to save one person was another second someone else could die. She stood up, her breath coming in quick gasps. Her eyes flicked back to the man and woman she had saved earlier. They were still alive, but they needed to be moved to safety. If she stayed here any longer, more people would die, more people who needed help. With a final, gut-wrenching look at the woman, Celira made her decision. She ran back toward the others, ordering them to move to the evacuation point. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The woman's cries echoed in her mind, but she had made the only choice she could. When the simulation ended, Elias stood waiting at the edge of the field. His eyes were fixed on her, unreadable as always. Celira's heart was pounding, but she held her head high, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You made the right choice," Elias said, his voice calm. "But it was a hard one." Celira didn't answer. She was too drained, too overwhelmed by what had just happened. "You will always face choices like that," Elias continued. "The weight of life and death will fall on your shoulders. It's never easy, but you must be prepared for it. You can't save everyone, Celira, not in a war, not when the stakes are this high." Her throat was tight, and she struggled to find the words to respond. "I don't know if I can do this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias studied her for a long time before he spoke again. "You already are," he said simply. "Every choice you make is part of who you become, but you will never stop facing hard decisions. That's the reality of leadership." Celira stood silently, the weight of the training pressing down on her, but somewhere deep inside her, something had shifted. She didn't know if she was ready. She didn't know if anyone could truly be ready for the kind of responsibility that Elias was asking her to shoulder. But she had learned one thing: she could survive this. She could survive the pain, the choices, the constant pressure. She had learned to endure, and no matter what came next, she would keep moving forward, because that was what leaders did. They kept moving forward, no matter the cost. The days following the rescue simulation were marked by a quiet tension that hung in the air like an impending storm. Celira could feel it as she walked across the training grounds, her steps slow and deliberate. Her body was growing stronger, her mind sharper, but with each passing day, the weight of her decisions seemed to grow heavier. The lessons Elias had taught her were no longer just exercises. They were preparing her for something real, something that would test her in ways she couldn't yet fully comprehend. Elias had not given her any new drills after the rescue operation. Instead, he watched her, observed her movements, and said very little. The silence between them spoke volumes. She could tell he was waiting for something, perhaps for her to prove that she was ready for what lay ahead. She had never been so uncertain about her own capabilities. As she sat in her small room later that evening, staring at the ceiling, her mind kept returning to the same thought. Am I ready? She had been trained to lead, to make decisions that could mean life or death for others. But there were still so many things she didn't know, things she wasn't sure she could do. The fear of failure gnawed at her, but Elias' words kept echoing in her mind. You can't save everyone. You can't control everything. But you must lead with what you have. The next morning, Celira was once again summoned to the training field. Elias stood at the edge of the course, watching as she approached. There was no greeting, no preamble, just the steady gaze that had become so familiar. "You're going to lead a small squad today," he said, his voice calm but firm. Celira's heart skipped a beat. She had led before in theory, but never with a team. Her training had always been individual, focused on her decisions, her actions. The thought of commanding others filled her with uncertainty. She had always been told that leadership was about strength, authority, and the ability to command respect. But human leadership, as she was beginning to realize, was about something else entirely. You'll be responsible for them, Elias continued. Their survival is in your hands. There will be a mission, and your choices will determine whether they succeed or fail. Celira nodded, trying to steady her breath. Her mind raced as Elias handed her a small comm device. Your squad will be waiting for you at the designated point, he said. Your mission is to infiltrate a mock enemy base and extract a VIP. You'll need to navigate through enemy territory, avoid detection, and ensure the VIP's safety. Her stomach tightened. This was no longer just a training exercise. This was real. People's lives would depend on her ability to lead them. She moved quickly, gathering the squad of 4 soldiers waiting at the starting point. They were all human, and their eyes followed her as she approached. Each of them looked capable, confident, everything Celira felt she was. For a brief moment, doubt washed over her. How could she lead these people who had so much more experience than her? How could she inspire confidence in them when she barely had any herself? But then she remembered Elias' words, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to keep moving forward." "All right," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We've got a mission. I'll be leading the way. Stay close, follow orders, and trust each other. We get in, we get the VIP, and we get out. No mistakes." The soldiers nodded, their expressions serious. Celira took a deep breath, then activated the comm device, receiving the coordinates for the enemy base. The plan was simple: infiltrate under cover of darkness, locate the VIP, and extract them without alerting the guards. It was a risky mission, but the stakes were high. Failure was not an option. As they moved through the dense forest toward the base, Celira's mind raced. She had never led a team before. She had never had to worry about anyone else's safety but her own. But the soldiers followed her without question, trusting her to guide them. The weight of their trust pressed on her, but she knew she couldn't falter. Not now. They reached the perimeter of the base, where Celira gave the order to split up. She would lead one group to the front gate, while the other would circle around to the back. The soldiers moved quickly, silently, their training taking over as they navigated the terrain. Celira's heart pounded in her chest as she led her team forward, keeping to the shadows, her senses alert for any sign of danger. They reached the outer wall of the base without incident. Celira checked the time. They were ahead of schedule. Everything was going according to plan, but then a voice crackled through the comm device. "We've been spotted," one of the soldiers said, his voice tight with urgency. "A guard is coming toward us. We need to move." Celira's heart skipped a beat. Her mind immediately shifted into action. Think. "Get down," she whispered to her team. They crouched low, blending into the shadows as the guard's footsteps grew louder. Celira held her breath, watching the soldier approach. The guard paused just a few meters away, scanning the area. Celira's pulse thundered in her ears. She knew they couldn't afford to be seen. Just as the guard started to turn, Celira motioned for the soldier closest to her to move in. With swift precision, the soldier subdued the guard, dragging him into the shadows. Celira's breath came in short bursts as she surveyed the area. They had avoided detection, for now. She didn't wait for a moment of relief. She gave the order to continue moving, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Every decision felt like it carried the weight of the mission on her shoulders. They reached the building where the VIP was being held. The doors were locked and the guards inside were unaware of their presence. Celira's mind raced as she weighed her options. They had no time to waste, and every second brought them closer to being discovered. "Explosives," she said, her voice steady. "We'll breach the door." Quickly and quietly. The soldiers set up the charges, and in seconds the door exploded inward. Celira's heart raced as she led the way inside. The guards inside were taken by surprise, and in the ensuing chaos, Celira's team quickly neutralized them. They moved fast, no room for hesitation. At the back of the room, Celira spotted the VIP, a middle-aged man, bound and unconscious. She rushed over to him, checking his pulse. He was alive but weak. She looked up at her team. "Get him to the extraction point," she ordered. As they moved through the corridors, Celira's mind raced. Everything was still going according to plan, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had felt it ever since they had been spotted, an unease that gnawed at her. Then as they reached the exit, it hit her. A trap. The doors to the extraction point slammed shut in front of them, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. More guards. Celira's heart sank. They had been ambushed. "Get to cover," she shouted. The team scattered, taking cover behind crates and debris. The soldiers fired back, holding off the advancing guards, but Celira knew they were running out of time. The guards were closing in, and the extraction point was too far away. Her mind worked quickly, analyzing the situation. They couldn't fight their way out of this. They had to find a way to outsmart the enemy. "Listen to me," Celira called, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't hold them off forever. We need a diversion." One of the soldiers looked at her, his face grim. "What do you have in mind?" Celira's eyes scanned the area, looking for anything that could help. Then she saw it, a ventilation shaft above them. It was small, but big enough for the VIP to fit through. She turned to her team. "We're going up," she said. "Get the VIP into that shaft, now." The soldiers reacted immediately, moving the VIP into position. Celira covered them, taking out several guards as they ascended the ladder. The guards were closing in on their position, but they had no choice. They had to move fast. Once the VIP was safely inside the shaft, Celira followed, her team climbing after her. They moved quickly through the narrow passage, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. As they emerged on the other side of the building, Celira's heart raced with relief. They had made it out. But the mission wasn't over yet. The extraction point was still a long way off. They had to cover several kilometers of open ground, and the guards would be on their trail. Celira's mind raced as she formulated a plan. They couldn't outrun them, they couldn't fight them, but they could use the terrain to their advantage. "Follow me," Celira said, her voice steady. "We're going off the grid." She led them through a series of winding paths, avoiding the main roads and using the natural cover of the terrain to stay hidden. The journey was slow and exhausting, but they kept moving, staying one step ahead of the enemy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the extraction point. The transport ship was waiting, engines humming softly in the distance. As they climbed,